there's a good likelihood Jared Kushner will be indicted for money laundering, and then we're going to have to see how far the Russian involvement goes.
Some of that was Jared Kushner's responsibilities. Some of it was Donald Jr. I think you're going to probably see indictments of both of those people.
I'm prepared to say something I've never said. The writing's on the wall. The walls are closing in. And this is the beginning of the end for the Trump administration.
All right, there you go. Democrats predicting the beginning of the end of the Trump administration, which has happened before it even started. Joining us now, a man that hears that and is responsible for responding and defending to make sure that doesn't happen. Rudy Giuliani, longtime friend of the president, confidant when he was running for president. After all, he's done it himself. And now he's the attorney for President Trump and former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Mr. Mayor, only appropriate on a day that WABC picks up the show that we have you on in the very first hour. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Brian. Great to be with you.
Well, first off, Mr. Mayor, you've heard those predictions before, and the tensions were ramped up this quarter. What is going to be your greatest challenge as you try to see around a corner, see around what the next shoe to drop will be?
Well, just how irresponsible the House of Representatives becomes. I mean, they promised in advance that they're going to hang him. So we sort of have a hanging jury. There's not much objectivity left when you hear things like you just played, right? So I think our attitude toward cooperation with them is going to be quite a bit different than it was in the early stages of this, where John Dowd says he regrets now cooperating so much because they double-crossed him. Here, we don't have to worry. They've already told us they'll double-cross us. And it sounds like the investigation would be a formality. They've already reached their conclusion. How they can do that without having seen any evidence is, of course, very disturbing.
Well, I mean, I also go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
But also indicates that they don't really care what the truth is. All they care about is getting him out of office.
Do you think that's Robert Mueller's goal?
Oh, Mueller? I'm talking about the Congress now.
Oh, the Congress.
Democrats.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know what Mueller's goal. I think it's probably Weissman's. I think he's got some people there that are, out of control Hillary people. You know how they are. I mean, they think, I get confronted with them just walking along the streets. I mean, some of them look like some of them do go to psychiatrists. I'm not saying Weissman needs to go to a psychiatrist, but some of them are overwrought. And they then tend to justify anything they do as okay because they see him as some kind of monster, which is ridiculous.
So with the president as his defense attorney, I remember when you decided to do this and, you had your injury in the summer, you got hurt, you rehabbed, you come back, you see the president's looking for new attorneys. He wanted you to do this right away. So you're doing this. And I guess in the beginning you said, I'm beginning to get a hold of the facts.
Right.
Are there some things that you don't know from your client who happens to be the President of the United States? Have you had to sit down with him and say, hey, Donald, you're my buddy, but I can't defend you unless I know everything? And there are some things that have popped up that maybe have caught everybody by surprise. Have you been caught by surprise?
I don't think so. I mean, a couple of things on going over in more detail. He remembered some facts they didn't remember before, but that's very, very common. But there weren't any. I don't think there's been a major surprise. The biggest surprises are all the things they've done wrong. I mean, probably the biggest surprise is that they somehow wiped out the texts of Strzok and Page, about 19,000 of them, and all of them happen to be during the time that they worked for Mueller. And you know that those texts are going to contain very derogatory things about the president because they couldn't help themselves. And that would really bear on their bias. I mean, the Inspector General rather concluded that Strzok had done very inappropriate things. So the stuff that he wrote about preventing him from being president, what a monster he would be, and then an insurance policy. But he didn't find that the bias infected the investigation. Now, suppose we had those texts of what he was working for Mueller, and suppose those texts explain that. Well, we'd have an investigation that we could probably argue should be dismissed because it's so tainted. But somehow, coincidentally, all those texts are missing. And Mueller's person wiped them out.
Right.
Well, that gets me really upset.
Well, a couple of things.
Really, because they're total hypocrites. If that had happened, if Flynn had done that, or the president, or Donald Jr., any one of them, man, they'd be indicted already.
Well, a couple of things, Mr. Mayor. I did not, when the president said I have no business in Russia, and then Michael Cohen says, and they said, well, I was talking about a Trump tower, a Moscow tower up until January of 2016. And then Michael Cohen says, no, it's June of 2016. And then it turns out there's a paper out there that shows they were going to have an agreement to move forward on a Moscow project. Does that make Rudy Giuliani look like he wasn't being candid because you didn't know everything?
No, I knew there was a Moscow project. I still don't know how long it went, and I don't consider it a Moscow project. I consider it a letter of intent without any money ever being put up, non-binding, which is the earliest stage of taking a look at a project. For example, if you asked me, let's pick a country that I'm not doing business in. Let's say Hungary. If you asked me, are you doing business in Hungary? And all I had was a proposal and a non-binding letter of intent, which I could have with 10 countries. I wouldn't tell you I'm doing business in Hungary. I'm not. I'd be misleading you if I said I was. He wasn't doing business in Moscow. Was he down the road looking at a project that had about 50 other steps to go through before it became a project? He probably was doing that in 8 countries. So I don't see how those two things are inconsistent unless you want to make them inconsistent, unless you don't want to hear a reasonable explanation for why he said that, which is what he told me when it turned out. Look, the simple fact is he doesn't remember how long it went. So he answered the question, so there's no perjury involved, by saying he and Cohen discussed the Moscow proposal. And he says, as far as he's concerned, it could be anywhere up to November of 2016. But if you ask him pinpoint the dates, he'd say, to me, 2015 and 2016 merged together. I know Michael would come to me, talk about the project.
Right.
I didn't have a great interest in it. My interest was focused on running for president. It was like you'd hear it out of one ear, and then you'd concentrate on, what am I being attacked for today?
Do you feel as though the president, Rudy, do you feel as though the president has said everything that Michael Cohen knows? Has the president told you everything that Michael Cohen knows in order for you to better defend the president?
Well, first of all, as far as he can remember, right? Michael Cohen is going to, let's assume the part Michael Cohen is telling the truth about. Michael Cohen will remember these things much better than the president because these were much more important to him. The Moscow thing was his project. For the president, it was one of 100 things going on at the time, and it probably was way down the list of importance, given the fact he was running for president. I remember running for president, and boy, I didn't pay much attention to my business at that time.
Right.
I mean, sometimes somebody would call me and ask me a question, and I'd say, go ahead with that or go ahead with this. But that wasn't what I was thinking about. I mean, he wasn't thinking about his business at that time. So, yeah, there could be some things where Cohen remembers it better than, and he's perfectly willing to say, Cohen may remember it better. I was wrong. He's right. However, there's another area. Cohen's lying about certain things. That we can't predict. We can't predict what he's lying about.
Right. I got a couple real quick topics. Let's just first off talk about the Mueller report. Catherine Herridge's reporting shows they're in the last throes. They expect it to wrap up in February. In the big concern that Democrats have is that Mueller will do his report, and you guys aren't going to allow it to get out. Is that a legitimate concern?
Well, it depends on what's in it, and it depends on how privileged it is, and it depends on whether it contains grand jury material, which is 6E material. I mean, it depends. I can't tell you that. I can't tell you without seeing it. I mean, we did. John Dowd and Ty Cobb did this when they turned these 1.4 million documents over. We reserved the right to claim executive privilege if they disclose it beyond the executive branch, which includes the Congress. That gives us a right to read the report, which is very necessary for us to be able to combat it. And then we'll decide.
Gotcha. I don't know if you saw the story in Politico that said that John Roberts had to get involved in the Mueller probe when they cleared out a whole floor at the D.C. District Court. Do you know what this is about? Why the Supreme Court's Chief Justice had to get involved?
I do not. I mean, I'm going to make a guess. It's something international. It may have to do with that case against the Russians, the 13 Russians who aren't going to come here and the one company that's defending. that lawyer has been dogged in his opposition to Mueller in court. I think they did a profile on him yesterday in the Times or the Post.
All right.
It might be that case, but I don't know for sure, Brian.
It's just strange. There's so much mystery still. Mr. Mayor, thanks so much for just scratching the surface and everything on your plate. Thanks so much for joining us on this day. Rudy Giuliani.